everyone, and welcome to Arts and Design Fridays. My name is Susan Moffett, and I am Creative Director of Future Histories Lab here at UC Berkeley and Executive Director of the Global Urban Humanities Initiative. And I want to give a warm welcome both to our public audience and to our students. This is a public speaker series as well as a course called Humanities 20, Explorations in Art and Design. And our theme this year is landscapes of incarceration, migration, and resistance. And today we're really excited to have architectural historians Lynne Horiuchi and Anoma Pieris here with us today. Before we dive in, I'm going to make a few announcements. Evelyn, I'm wondering, should everyone be seeing just the title slide, or I think we're yeah. Okay.
You're seeing the behind the scenes.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Sorry, folks. This is our first talk that we're doing on Zoom, and if I seem a little flummoxed, it's because we've really been enjoying meeting in person, and all of these talks in the speaker series are live and in person at the Osher Theater at Banff. So I just want to let folks know that if you want to come to future events, they are usually in person. But because Anoma Pieris is coming to us from Australia and got up very early, that's why we're on Zoom today. So in terms of announcements, I want to let the public audience know first that this talk today is one part of a whole year of exhibitions, performances, and courses that are centered on Angel Island as a jumping off spot for thinking about immigration, othering, and belonging. And if you want to learn more about the other activities, you can go to futurehistories.berkeley.edu. You can sign up for a newsletter, and you'll find out some of the many interesting things that are going on that you can attend as part of the public. Now, for students, I want to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. If you are interested in going on the field trip to Angel Island, we have one more field trip left on October 15th. I think we have just a couple of slots left. If you're interested, you can sign up in the form with the URL that Evelyn is going to drop in the chat. And that is for students only. And you can also email Shelby Kendrick if you have any questions about it. We can't guarantee you a slot, so after you sign up, please be sure to receive a confirmation from us that you have a spot on the field trip. I also want to remind students that there are wonderful tours of the Banff exhibition, Undoing Time, Art and Histories of Incarceration, and those are led on Wednesdays and Sundays by underground scholars, which is a really great group of students who have been impacted by incarceration. And I think that they will be especially interesting guides to that exhibition. I also want to make a couple of announcements about some interesting theater pieces that are available that are really tied in very well with our themes of othering and belonging and immigration. First, for the public audience, on October 21st, we are having a talk in this Friday series on a play called Illegal, which is a musical that uses the interrogations of Chinese immigrants at Angel Island as the starting point for a musical. And also at that talk, we will have Jeffrey Lowe, who is the director of The Paper Dreams of Harry Chin, which is a wonderful play that was recently at San Francisco Playhouse, also on that theme. Also going on, coming up starting November 4th, and I really want to highlight this for students at Aurora Theater, which is in downtown Berkeley. There's a new play about food culture, appropriation, appreciation, and xenophobia. It's called Colonialism is Terrible, but Pho is Delicious. It's by Dustin Chin. It's very funny, and we can get you some discount student tickets. If you're interested, please email me if you're interested in going to that. We may also be able to set up some conversations with the actors and director of that play. Also, another play relating to our themes is at Berkeley Rep. I just saw it last night. It's amazing. The Ripple The Wave That Carried Me Home is a play about the desegregation of public swimming pools. As you may know, in the 1960s, all across America, when legally public pools were required to desegregate, many cities and municipalities chose to drain and shut down their pools rather than allow Black and white people to share the same water. And this play, which is set in the 1990s, at the time of the acquittal of the police officers who beat Rodney King, this play uses the character of a woman whose parents did the activism around pool desegregation as a centerpiece to think about bodies and public space and the way that we sometimes other human beings. So those are some plays that I encourage students to consider going to. I will also provide information on how to get student discounts. We're hoping that this course, Explorations in Art and Design, will help you make going to theater, going to museums, looking at the themes we are looking at through arts, that will become a habit. So that's why I'm often making announcements about opportunities in the community. So now I'm going to move on to the main event for today. And I'm going to start by introducing our speakers, and then I'm going to give a little bit of framing of how their talk fits into this semester as a whole. So first, I want to introduce Lynne Horiuchi, who is an architectural historian whose work is cross-disciplinary, examining concepts of imprisonment, race, space, mobility, everyday racism, and civil justice. She's co-author of The Architecture of Confinement, Incarceration Camps, and the Pacific War with Anoma Pieris, and that's the book we'll be talking about today. And Lynne is also writing a book on the production of prison camps built for Japanese Americans during World War II. She also co-edited a book about Treasure Island, and she serves on the board of the Society of Architectural Historians and is co-chair of the Minority Scholars Affiliate Group, and is active in the Asian American and Diasporic Architectural History Affiliate and the Race and Architecture Affiliate groups. She received her PhD in Modern Architecture and Urbanism from the University of California at Santa Barbara. And Lynne has also been a really important part of our work in Future Histories Lab. She taught a summer course on race redevelopment and gentrification about the Hoover Durant neighborhood in West Oakland, where she lived for many years. That was a really terrific humanities studio course that had students working closely with the Friends of the Hoover Durant Library. And I want to give a big shout out to Lynne for that fantastic course. And she's publishing an article about that work very soon. And I think that that's going to be really interesting for people to access that kind of community engaged pedagogy through that article. Next, I want to introduce Anoma Pieris, who is professor of architecture at the Melbourne School of Design. Thank you for waking up so early, Anoma. She is co-author with Lynne of The Architecture of Confinement, and among her many books are Architecture and Nationalism in Sri Lanka, The Trouser Under the Cloth, Hidden Hands and Divided Landscapes, A Penal History of Singapore's Plural Society, Sovereignty, Space, and Civil War in Sri Lanka, and Architecture on the Borderline, Boundary Politics and Built Space. She's the author of Indigenous Museums and Cultural Centers and Illustrated International Survey. Such a productive scholar. She holds a degree from the University of Moratuwa, Sri Lanka, and an MArch and SM Arcs from MIT, and a PhD from UC Berkeley, and an MPhil in geography from the University of Melbourne. Welcome, Anoma. Before I invite Lynne and Anoma to speak, I just want to remind students of where we are in the course of the semester. First, we started out thinking about the Indigenous history of Angel Island. And I want to start our conversation today by acknowledging that here in Berkeley, we are in the land of Huichin, which is the ancestral homeland of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone peoples, who are still very much among us and important leaders in the community. And Angel Island, the territory kind of at the center of our investigations this semester, that is the territory of the Coast Miwok people. And for members of the audience who weren't with us for the first talk, Greg Saris, who is a Coast Miwok leader, gave a really wonderful talk on the indigenous history of Angel Island and surrounding areas. And I really encourage you to go to futurehistories.berkeley.edu. You can see his video there, and it gives us a good grounding for starting our conversation about this place. So we started with indigenous history, and then so far we've been thinking about some genres that help us think about immigration, othering, and belonging. We've gone through theater, dance, painting, Asian American activism. Later this semester, our speakers will be talking about performative walking tours, photography, musical theater, film, sculpture, poetry, and finally choral and orchestral music. Today, we are focusing on architecture and architectural history, and we're thinking about the ways that the built environment reflects our understanding of human beings, and how we as a society construct spaces to confine and define these human beings, especially those that we define as other. So we'll be looking at buildings and landscapes and sites today, not just as history, but also as places where memory is constructed and as places of commemoration. And I think the work of Lynne and Anoma on this, the question of monuments and memorials and commemoration is super interesting. So I'm going to stop there because I'm really excited and looking forward to hearing both Lynne and Anoma's presentations. And I will invite Lynne to begin her talk. Welcome, Lynne. We can't hear you yet.
So thank you, Susan. And thank you, everybody, for coming today to hear us, and thank you for the Indigenous acknowledgement. We share the same area, so I think that will suffice for both of us today. Thank you. Well, welcome, and I think I will first start by explaining that, well, the title of our talk is Border Thinking Through Wartime Incarceration Environments. But I really need to explain that this is really Anoma's project, and I sort of tagged along. But we had a wonderful collaboration, and I'd like Anoma to speak just a little bit about that, because she really formulated and structured this project. Anoma?
So I'm speaking from Australia. Where I am is in Melbourne, and I'm in the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation. And I want to begin by acknowledging that and paying my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I think, Lynne, you were going to sort of introduce the book, and then maybe I'll pick it up as we go along.
Okay,
Thank you.
Yeah, so just to explain, for me, this was a really amazing opportunity, and it was my contribution to this book was a chapter and a half. We did, however, work closely on many sections, and the title of our book was the Architectures of Confinement, Incarceration Camps of the Pacific War. So we basically looked at the Pacific Rim and looked at comparative examples of confinement sites, and Anoma will really speak mostly about that. I will speak about my chapters, which were on Manzanar Relocation Center. For me, this was a liberating experience that drew me out of the study of the American confinement sites as a nationally siloed study that was tightly bound to Asian American studies, and then sites that I could interpret through architecture, planning, and landscape. And I make that reference to Asian American studies because, in part because of the way that ethnic studies was created. We tend to look at these Asian American studies as very nationally bound, and we're beginning to look at them in diasporic ways. So this was part of what evolved out of this collaboration with Anoma. And I'll just give you, I'll actually read the first part of the first paragraph to give you the frame for the book. So we provide a new starting point for analyses of wartime built environments, framed by the assumption that sovereignty has unimagined complexities, and that the material worlds of internment and prisoner war or POW camps in settler societies offer valuable insights into the forms of geopolitical awareness surfacing in mid-20th century. And this is all wrapped around World War II. This is a historical period marked by imperial conflict. The book is organized around 3 geographical areas directly affected by Japan's military aggression. So it's Australia, Singapore, and the USA. And we work in comparative case studies to examine how social conditions associated with the sites of confinement were politicized by war, and how individuals effectively responded to their dislocations and confinement. So the comparative part of our this book, I think, is an important part of it. And Anoma has built the largest part of that, and my part will be on Manzanar as my case history for this book. And I will begin sharing my screen now. Let's see. Oh, okay, I just blocked out my other screen. Border thinking through wartime incarceration environments. So these are the sites I'll be, I actually examine. I look at the confinement sites of the Japanese American incarceration. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, during World War II, about approximately 120,000 people were forcibly removed from their homes, disenfranchised, and relocated in the government terms to assembly centers and relocation centers. And this map shows those sites. The particular sites that I was interested in were these flag sites, which were the relocation centers, that really function like urban cities. Before I get into that, I wanted to also talk a little bit about Angel Island, because Susan asked me to link this event to Angel Island, and it is inextricably linked. So I want to give, first of all, a little bit of a prehistory of Angel Island. That was originally the Oriental Warehouse. The immigration in San Francisco was really located in the heart of San Francisco, in the port and commerce area near 2nd and Townsend, where the Oriental Warehouse served as an immigration station for people coming from Asia on crossing the Pacific. So that was it was built in 1857 and functioned as an immigration station until 1910, when, of course, Angel Island was opened up. It was a modern brick building with fire bays, which were a very innovative kind of fire protection function. But it was not set up for immigrants. It was set up for the storage of the Pacific Mail Steamship, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, which ran the steamships that were trans-Pacific, that docked in Yokohama and Shanghai and other places. So many Chinese immigrants arrived in the United States that way. And after 1882, then, and beginning in the early 1890s, Japanese immigrants arrived at the Oriental Warehouse. And in fact, they settled close by in South Park, close to 2nd and Townsend, if you know that area in downtown San Francisco, in a very lovely early planned community at South Park. They eventually, with the opening of the 1910 Immigration Center, this was based on the really horrible conditions in Oriental Warehouse for the immigrants. There were no bathing, no toilet facilities there, and very problematic. And that led to the opening of Angel Island. At least that was some of the reasons for doing that. Excuse me just a minute. But this is a Angel Island's history then it's becomes this microcosm, very much like the boundary and bounded sites that we Anoma and I study. So it's a microcosm of the intersections of Japanese immigrants and Chinese immigrants. And then during World War II, a complete transformation of the island sets in as a Fort McDowell. It came under the U.S. Western Defense and Fourth Army, and it was set up as another confinement space, but for POWs and for alien enemies. There was primarily Japanese from Hawaii who were arrested under the U.S. Alien Enemies Act of 1798. There were also Japanese POWs, and all of these people transited through Angel Island. There were also Germans and Italians from Hawaii that came through Angel Island during World War II. There were Japanese from Northern California that were incarcerated temporarily at Angel Island. That was also under the same act and the Alien Sedition Act. These were Japanese citizens for the most part, but there were even Niseis from Hawaii that were incarcerated at Angel Island. They were shipped to Angel Island for dispersal to other internment camps, which are not the ones that I'm showing here, under that were established under an executive order, but under these other laws that applied to Japanese citizens. They were sent to places like in New Mexico, Crystal City, in Texas, to U.S. Army sites in Bismarck, and Bismarck, Idaho. They were sent to Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. And these were because they were Japanese citizens, mostly. Of course, the Chinese were not picked up. They were not the enemy alien, but the Japanese, Germans, and Italians were, and they all crossed over Angel Island. So there's this terrific porosity of Angel Island that demonstrates a lot of the things that we talk about in our book. The Nisei, by the way, were sent back to Hawaii because the Department of Justice had concerns about interning American citizens. But in the case that you're looking at on this slide, this was directed by Presidential Executive Order 90666, which was issued by Franklin D. Roosevelt on February 19th, 1942. And so it's like many of the presidential orders that you've seen proliferate in recent years. It was solely authorized by Roosevelt, and he gave to the U.S. Army the responsibility for carrying out this first to set military zones, and then to exclude anyone that might be suspected of espionage or spying from those areas. So that's how this whole movement got set up. This movement, a mass incarceration of 120,000 people of, quote, Japanese ancestry. And they were moved without charges. There were no substantiation of espionage or of possible sabotage. So it has become like a premier contestation of the Constitution. In many ways, it's brought up as an example in many cases where there are confinement or threats of confinement or similar kinds of actions proposed for other groups. And it's been tested both in Congress and in the courts. So it's a very famous case in terms of rule of law. And that's one of the reasons that this particular study of the incarceration camps has become so siloed nationally. It's really tied to really the basic concepts of our Constitution and our basic civil rights. So it's a very important case, and nationally. But internationally, we can see this also tied to the ideas of imperialism, both Japanese and American. And those do come up in our book. Those are really important themes in our book, and exactly how these kinds of imperialism and military imperialism functioned. In this case, show this. I did forget one thing. I'm sorry. This is actually a map used by Carl Bentonson. So he sort of can be the iconic sort of. So also really called himself the architect of the Japanese American incarceration, and he was very influential in crafting the Executive Order of 9066 out of the U.S. Army's office. And he became the chief of the Wartime Civil Control Administration, which was a division in the Western, the Western Defense and Fourth Army that was based in Presidio. And they were the people that were responsible for the entire incarceration. And that initially, eventually there was a wartime relocation authority that was set up to administer the camps. So there are these two government functions that were very important initially in the incarceration. That's the U.S. military and the War Relocation Administration, or we call it the WRA. So materially, in terms of architecture, in terms of building and planning, the military had like probably the most important role in creating these environments in these semi-permanent camps, where people went from assembly centers and then they went into these semi-permanent camps. Many of them calculated for 5,000, 10,000 and up to 20,000 people. So this was a mass incarceration. This was a very significant incarceration in terms of numbers and scale. So on the material scale, it's huge, enormous amounts of material to build these camps, and everything that was required to provide for the camps. So the entire infrastructure was built that would be built for a city. There were no roads per se, because it was a pedestrian city, but there was the electrical, the water sources had to be built. Roads for access had to be built. So it was a significant development project to build these cities. And it was on a significant scale for domestic projects in the United States. And this was all based on a president, actually the Army that racialized this project by sending out exclusion orders in order to round up all Japanese Americans based on the census information that they gathered. They gathered up Japanese and Japanese Americans to be sent to these camps with no established charges. So they were very unique in that way, very bounded by this military building. So, and you can see this, of course, and this is this gridded out plan. They're composed of blocks. So there are these blocks, and this is the block standard plan, which would include barracks, generally 6 or 7 on each side, and then communal facilities that were placed inside the blocks. There would be a mess hall, a latrine. I'm not sure, I can't quite read. It's the laundry is separated out in this case for the Manzanar typical block plan. And otherwise you have the military, you have staff housing here. Oops, I'm sorry. Staff housing is here. Much of the administration is here. You can see the barbed wire bounding the camp. And then you can see all the separation. This is a segregated city with the white administration. Oh, I'm sorry, staff housing is down here. This is the hospital, I'm sorry. Staff housing here, administration here, and the hospital here. So this was a segregated city. This is where the white people lived. This is where the Japanese people of Japanese ancestry lived. So what I'm going to show you today is I've done a lot of research on building in the camps, and there was an enormous amount of building by the residents themselves. They were given this received environment, this like very rigid structured environment, but the employees were like quite ingenious in recreating for themselves some of the community that they had left behind, and also creating for themselves places for recreation, for community activities, for spaces and parks and sites where they could seek shade. In many of these places, they were in very rural, isolated areas, very much contained like the archipelago examples of Solzhenitsyn. They were like enclosed, isolated in areas, rural areas. So they have very few materials as well. They were unfree labor. They're being used, their labor was structured to be used for industrial products, which in Manzanar, that was like camouflage nets. There were several other defense industries that were started at Manzanar. There was even a top secret project to create synthetic rubber. So there are all of these things going on at Manzanar, but they were not paid very well, of course. They were paid maybe 1/10 of what people outside these camps were being paid for the activities that they were doing. They, of course, didn't have access to materials. They had to figure out how to bring those materials in. And they were pretty ingenious at doing that, and actually achieve levels with all the movement of people in and out of this incarceration, because people were moved in, but then they also were released to be settled in other areas. So there's constant changing of people in positions and directing these kinds of activities, like building this park in Manzanar. This is what's called the pleasure park. This is the pool in the pleasure park. And you can see this this really beautiful landscaped area with lawn, stepping stones, with rustic bridges. Something was called like the pagoda. This gazebo. I'm sorry, gazebo, and the tea house, I think, is in some other area. But you can see they're in like this rustic sort of Adirondack style. But there's also like very many Japanese elements in these gardens. I will show you a few more of those. But so there's this creation of sites that are harking back to a Japanese culture that really gave that gave solace and gave a resting place and provided a civic center for Manzanar in some ways, a place where people could meet. It was like a civic park. It was renamed Merritt Park. It was initially named Pleasure Park by the residents, and then renamed by the director Merritt Park after himself. So, but it's quite an elaborate. You only see part of it here, but it's quite an elaborate park. It includes a number of waterfalls, a fairly long stretch of a stream, as well as all of these other elements. There's stepping stones. There are different paths along the stream. So this is one of the more significant elements that the residents were able to create at Manzanar. And they did a lot of other building, like dojo studios and basketball courts and baseball diamonds, golf courses that are all sand, but golf courses. They did a lot of urban planning, and they managed to find materials to do this, which is really extraordinary. So I'll explain about a few other sites. I just want to show you this one to start, to sort of demonstrate their ingenuity doing this. And I'm showing you one other type that actually is this restored garden. That's at the Manzanar National Historic Site in it's located in the Eastern Sierras. I'm sorry if I didn't tell you that. It's in the Eastern Sierras of California, located between Lone Pine and Bishop. And you can see it's actually a beautiful site, but cold in the wintertime, hot in the summertime. And with this, the people in the barracks had very little protection from those sort of extreme conditions. But they made these beautiful parks. This is a mess hall garden. So it's smaller, much smaller in scale than Pleasure Park. And it was created to be a resting spot while people were waiting in line to get into the mess hall. But also just is a really beautiful spot. And you can see how elaborate this garden is with its different waterways. It's the hydraulics, the placement of the stones, the creation of waterways and waterfalls and pools was really extraordinary for this small garden. It's been restored now, and you can actually visit it at the Manzanar National Historic Site. You can go there and drive the self-guided tour and get to both the Merritt Garden, which is being restored, and the pleasure pool, and this mess hall garden. And the person who's done the work on this is Jeff Burton. He's the archaeologist. He's been an archaeologist for these sites for decades. And so he's developed some really formidable archaeological programs and to restore these sites, but also to look generally at all the sites, and particularly at Manzanar. He's been able to develop these really beautiful drawings, which give us a really concrete idea of like how these gardens were built, what they look like. So you can see it's sort of an elevated here, and this waterway run down, split into two streams and into this pool. And this was all along the mess hall, and this is where probably people were waiting to go into the mess hall, alongside Barracks 14. And this is his drawings, his data that he created. It's just really amazing data that he created for us about the development of gardens and parks at Manzanar, and exactly how this came about, how this was enabled, what were the factors that created this. I think it's really extraordinary because he really documents how Manzanar was really there was this greening of Manzanar by the residents. And then initially it started with all different kinds of like garden projects and agricultural projects and the victory gardens. The victory gardens were right here, and they were very substantial, large victory gardens. But there are also like smaller events like the distribution of lawnmowers. This was started because WRA decided that in order to control the dust, because there were horrible dust storms at Manzanar. In fact, at many of these sites, the dust was really a problem because initially they cleared the entire land and there was nothing left but dust, and then there were barracks. So the residents were given seed to create lawns. And this distribution of lawnmowers shows us like probably how many green areas there were with just lawns in Manzanar. So that was sort of like a small kind of event, but there were like larger things that happened. And these were with the leadership of the Japanese gardeners and nursery owners and landscapers at Manzanar, which they had a greater proportion than a lot of other camps of these people with professional skills to develop the landscape. So Jeff Burton goes about documenting this, and it's really interesting. He shows us the intensity of the number of this graphic is of nursery owners and flower growers. So these are people that had like major enterprises pre-war and then landed there in these camps. And what they did was these people were very influential in creating the Cherry Park and Merritt Park, of course. And the Cherry Park is really interesting because it was a development of a man who lost my notes here, but there were 1,000 cherry trees that were brought in by a man who got, let's see if I can find my notes here. I can't really see them.
Lynn, I just want to let you know that we want to make sure to get to Anoma as well. So
Okay.
Loving these garden stories.
Okay, so I just will then briefly tell the story. Like I'm trying to find my notes here. Anyway, I wanted to name the names, but there was one man who owned a nursery in Los Angeles in Southern California. He was able to go there and bring back 1,000 cherry trees in his truck. They were also allowed to go out and look for rocks and trees and whatever. So there was this porosity that also helped create this, but also these very skilled people and these people with the entrepreneurial skills to create these places. So they really basically created greening for almost this entire area here. In the Children's Village, Merritt Park, North Park. This was a park also. So just to finish up here, so when to show you, get you some faces of these people. These are the people that are in front of the gazebo at Children's Village, but they also landscaped, and they created this gazebo for them. And so these are many of the people that worked on Merritt Park and Cherry Park as well, which they were all adjacent to Children's Village in that area. And this is Sue Clooney told me, Embry, maybe we can speak about her a little bit later, but she's the reason we have this legacy of the National Manzanar Historic Site. She really was the main person carrying the load in participating in meetings and pushing for the creation of the park, pushing for this national landmark status and for the name of saying right out that these were concentration camps. And she in fact got a lot of pushback from even the Japanese American community about that, but she persevered, and she really was with Rose Oichi, the main engine behind this. And I'm just showing her a Tankobushi with the Daiko at one of the Manzanar pilgrimages. So that's it. I pass it on to Anoma. Sorry, apologies for going over, Anoma.
Lynn, if you can unshare, then I can, yes. So I'm just going to share the video, which shows you a little bit of what the landscape looks like. And I thought I'd pick up on a few of the elements that we see. And also to tell you that part of our collaborative process was to go to Manzanar and participate in the annual pilgrimage together. And the pilgrimage was set up in order to, originally, in order to address the care of the graves and the soul consoling tower that you saw at the beginning of this video. So it's important part of this history is about the care for remains. So when there are human remains, even if the material context of the camps have been completely dismantled or destroyed, there is a sense that something sacred is happening in this site and you need to maintain it. And this has been one of the reasons why Remembrance Gardens have been set up in certain sites, which we have looked at. And this is something that I was interested in pursuing. So Lynne, this is the garden that you showed in the image is dead. The Merritt Park, this is
Merritt Park.
These are some of the features of that garden. And this is what you see when you go to the site today. And you can get a sense of the landscape. And really, I can't convey how windy and dusty it is, which is really one of the factors which makes it quite unbearable in the summer heat or in the winter cold. These are some of the gardens that Lynne showed you. Now, an interesting difference was the ways in which gardens were approached for remembrance in Canada, which is in the Canadian Rockies, in the mountains, in British Columbia. This is a little town called New Denver. And there's a kind of museum and memorial center set up for the incarceration of the Canadian, the Japanese Canadian people or the people of Japanese ancestry in Canada. And what they did there was they actually created a garden based on the landscaping practices that had happened in the camps. And they brought the actual, they called them shacks, in which people had been living, and placed them in the garden, almost like the pavilions you find in a Japanese garden, like the tea houses. So here you're seeing the shacks that the people were actually living in, and it's set in this sort of dry garden landscape. And it's quite beautiful in the spring, which was the time when I visited it, and you can see how beautiful the landscaping is. So this is an idea of using gardens in order to evoke what happened in the camps. But there is at the heart of it, I guess, the problem of what happens when you aestheticize a remembrance practice, and how do you then convey the trauma that was associated with it? Does it actually mask aspects of that trauma? And here, when you look at the actual buildings, and in a moment we'll walk into one of them, you'll see that they have collected all the artifacts that people have donated, and they've placed them in there, not in a curated fashion, but as a collection of objects inside the shacks themselves. So, Lynne, did you want to say something about the difference between maybe the ways of living in a unit, in a family unit, versus the ways in which it was set up in Manzanar?
Well, yeah, that actually was a really big difference between one of the differences between the camps, and that the US, the 9066 camps, EO 9066 camps, they had communal facilities for eating and for latrines. There was no water going to the barracks. There was just only electricity. So that broke down the family unit within the camps. And so generationally, Japanese community is broken down into like Issei, Nisei, Sansei, 3 different generations at that time. First, second, third first was immigrant, second American born, and third would be somebody like me, would be very young. They have very different experiences in the camps. And of course, speaking in terms of citizenship and civil rights, they were very different too. But I also just forgot to point out actually that these camps, like you said, they mask some of the violence of the material violence of the camps. And it's something that I think we need to keep in mind. And that also is with this clash of ideologies, which we really have not talked about much in Asian American studies or in Japanese American studies, in part because of the redress movement. We really didn't talk about the Issei nationalism and how that functioned, national ideology, and how that functioned, even culturally, looking at these landscape gardens and what that meant.
So I'm going to now move into my part of the talk, and I'm going to share my screen. So I want to begin also by thanking Susan and Evelyn, because I didn't really get a chance at the beginning. So thank you very much for having me, and for all of you for attending this talk. It's a real opportunity for me to share this work from far away. And I was thinking about how to frame it, and it's really about gardens of remembrance. How do you see them as different to the kind of monumental sites that are set up after a war by the military? And I wanted to compare the commemorative strategies. And these are some examples of camps in Australia and the kinds of gardens that were created by Japanese people who were interned in Australia. So Australia became a kind of like a holding place for prisoners that were taken by the British and by the Americans in the two theaters of the war, in Europe and in Asia. And so there were Japanese and Italians and Germans and many nationalities of the Axis partnership who ended up in Australia in these isolated camps. So isolation becomes doubled because they are not only put in camps, which have barbed wire and searchlights and all this around them, but they're also displaced from the continental geographies that they're on, or from Japan. And here you see examples of, you can see the kind of Japanese aesthetic of the garden, but below you can also see on the left, a tennis clubhouse that was built by the Japanese internees. And what's interesting about that is that you can see that they're also modern. I mean, they're playing tennis, they have their sort of shrines and their gardens as well. And on the right at the bottom is a little model of the Colosseum, which was built by the Italian prisoners of war. And so you're beginning to see that there are different groups showing their kinds of place memories through their garden practices. And this is something I want you to hold on to, because it's the way in which place memory becomes the vehicle through which we begin to accommodate people's difference and create an empathetic understanding by the willingness to incorporate ideas of other people's places in our own geographies as a commemorative strategy. So here's the scope of our project. You can see that we were picking up on sites around an arc of the Pacific Basin. And I have numbered the sites, and you can see we have 2 in North America, New Denver and Manzanar, which we spoke of just briefly. And then Australia and Japan. So I'm going to kind of compare Australia and Japan. And that's the book that we co-authored. Now, what were these sites actually like? So at the end of the war, what happened was, during the war, the sites were taken from farmers and the camps were built on these previous farmlands. And because of that, at the end of the war, it had to be returned to the farmers. Because of this, all of the buildings that were on the sites were dismantled and auctioned off. So today, when we go to the sites, all we see are what remains of the toilet blocks, because they had concrete bases. And there isn't anything to really use in order to begin to evoke that history. And this is a problem that we face, particularly in Australia, because there were no citizens who were incarcerated. These were all people who were being held on behalf of Britain or the US. So Australia didn't feel any responsibility towards it, even though they should have felt a responsibility. Consequently, there was no redress movement that could make the Australian government accountable for having interned what they called enemy aliens in Australia, or holding prisoners of war captured by these other enemy forces, by their allied forces, or overseas internees who were sent as refugees from Britain to Australia, including Jewish people and also other diasporic groups from the Middle East and from the Pacific Islands, including Japanese pearl divers, cane farmers from the region. So it's a very complex kind of social group that ended up in the Australian camps. Now I'm going to focus on a particular escape story, and this is at the Cowra prisoner of war camp, which you saw a moment ago, the site. Now, why am I looking at prisoners of war? So we tend to look at civilian internees and we focus on that. But in fact, the people who are being recruited or enlisted during this time were ordinary farmers and people with ordinary jobs who were either conscripted or decided to enlist because they needed the opportunity or were looking for an opportunity. In some cases, they may not have had a choice. So they were actually ordinary people. They were not necessarily people who were trained and already in the military, although there were a portion of that. The vast number of soldiers who participated in the Second World War were everyday people. And this is something we often forget. Now, this is an incident that happened in 1944 when there was an attempted breakout of 1,001 Japanese prisoners of war from a prisoner of war camp in Australia. And until that happened, Australians weren't aware that there were prisoners of war being held in their home territory. The Australian camps were at the south of the continent, and you can see that they're all sort of a distance away from Japan because the Japanese attack would have happened from the north. The camps themselves are rather awkward geometries, and you can see it's a dodecagon figure, a 12-sided kind of figure. And there is a broad kind of fire break in the center called Broadway. And then the huts are actually arranged in a radial pattern with guard towers at different corners of the enclosure. And that's what the actual prisoner of war camp looked like. Now, the compound on the top, compound B, is where the Japanese were held, but you can also see that there are Formosans and Koreans, and that there are Italians in this same camp, and they're only divided by fencing. So you can get a sense of the complexity of the population that was in the Australian camps. This is a scene from that breakout. So what happens is that on the early hours of the 5th August 1944, the Japanese prisoners of war who are in this camp decide to stage a breakout in the dark. They set fire to the huts to create a kind of distraction, throw blankets over the barbed wire, that's what you're seeing in this image here, and try to escape the camp. But in the process, the guards who are alerted turn a machine gun on the prisoners. And as a result, the consequence of this kind of turmoil and attack, 231 Japanese prisoners of war are killed. And this is a tragedy, and it's the first and the largest kind of tragedy to occur on Australian territory during the war. On top of that, there are 235 casualties. A few prisoners escape, but they are easily caught and brought back because, of course, the surrounding farmlands are pretty bare, as you can see in this photograph. Now, the burial of these soldiers, these Japanese soldiers in Australia's soil, becomes an issue. On the one hand, the Japanese government is not willing to accept that there has been a tragedy of this kind in Australia because the Japanese military code doesn't allow people to be taken prisoner. There is shame associated with being taken prisoner. So the Japanese government takes a while to accept and come to terms with the idea that there are Japanese soldiers buried in Australian soil. And it's only in the 1960s that the governments begin to speak to each other, and they set up a cemetery in Cowra. And this becomes possible because the Return Services League in Kara of the Australian soldiers who are fighting in Asia have a kind of sympathetic connection to the Japanese soldiers, and they take care and tend their graves until the point that the cemetery is built. And here you can see the Japanese style of cemetery. It's the only one that is outside Japan for soldiers of the Pacific War. In the 1970s, when Japan is becoming a stronger economic power, and in some ways the process of the war has been sort of diluted, the kind of military imperialism has receded. Japan has become this new sort of capitalist power under American stewardship. There is a wool manufacturing company from Japan decides to come to Kara to invest. And the Kara Tourism Board has a kind of, I guess, inspiration to create a Japanese garden. And a person called Don Kibler conceives of this idea and looks for funding. And they have a competition, and an landscape, Japanese landscape, kind of master landscape designer called Ken Nakajima designs this very beautiful landscape in Kara. Now, Kara is a terrain which has a lot of large rocky outcrops. In fact, Kara is the local Wiradjuri, which is the indigenous group in the area. The Wiradjuri's name for rocks, so it means rocky landscape. And there are a lot of gum trees, which are eucalyptus trees, which you can see on the horizon. And so this garden begins to actually tame the unruly Australian landscape into a Japanese garden. And I want you to see this as a way of inserting a sense of Japan in Australian territory. Now, Kara is about 2 hours north of the capital of Australia, Canberra. And you can imagine it's in a small rural town. They're not very small, a large rural town, I would say. And you come upon this Japanese garden. There are no signs of the history of the breakout in the garden itself, but the incongruity of having a space of Japan in Australia itself makes you ask questions. You know, what is it doing here? The garden was designed in order to provide a place for the Japanese soldiers who were buried in the cemetery to find some kind of release. In other words, it was conceived as a space where they could feel at home in Australia because they had to remain there. And I thought that was quite a beautiful idea. Now, the Kara Japanese garden, its designers and those involved have a close connection with another garden, but which is a peace park in a place called Naoetsu in Japan. And this collaboration is also very interesting. Naoetsu is kind of north of Tokyo, but on the other shore of Japan, and is in a very sort of vulnerable industrial town, vulnerable climate-wise, because the winters are very harsh. And it's one of the places in which there was a prisoner of war camp for Australian and US soldiers who were captured by the Japanese. So the other side of the story. And you can see that this is a peace park. It's not a Japanese garden. And it's a strange kind of condition in which Australia is creating a Japanese garden and Naoetsu is creating a peace park in a European or modern or Western style of landscape design. So the Japan had a large number, about 130 prisoner of war camps on the Japanese archipelago itself. And Naoetsu was one of them, the one that is indicated in the triangle in the map of Japan. These were factory camps. In other words, the prisoners of war were kept in factory warehouses, and this is a chemicals warehouse for a particular company, and they would have to work in those factories. So they were working for the war industry, which was actually not permitted by the Geneva Convention. But Japan had not signed the Geneva Convention And because of that, it was exploiting the labor of prisoners of war in their steelmaking, coal and chemical industries. And this is what the Naoetsu campsite would have looked like. Now, one of the issues of this particular campsite and why I selected it was because there were a high number of casualties, and there were a large number of Australians who died in this particular camp because of harsh treatment by the guards. And this meant that it was one of the sites which came up with the Yokohama war crimes trials after the war. And so there was a lot more sort of attention to what had happened in this space. Because of the numbers of people who died in this camp, there was an issue about what would happen to their remains. So just like I said, the remains were important in Kara as well as Manzanar. What would happen to the human remains? And there was a priest called Henry Fujito at the nearby Kakushinji temple, who had befriended the prisoners of war, and he decided to retain their ashes and kept them in the temple till the time that they could be buried in the Yokohama War Cemetery. And this empathetic gesture by him enabled the people of Naoetsu later to begin to form some kind of reconciliatory relationship with Australians and Australian families connected to this story in Naoetsu. So let's look at the Peace Park. You can see that it's very much a Western style park. There are these two beautiful statues which were commissioned by an artist, and they represent Japan and Australia. There are a number of small features. There is a house that existed on the site. So the chemical warehouse had been dismantled, but someone had built a house on the site. So by the time that the Peace Park was set up in the 1980s, it was really a case of, re-landscaping what had become a vacant lot. And these are some of the features of that building. So you can see the entrance, there's a koala, which is an Australian animal. At the entrance welcoming you, there are the statues in the center. There's this, this figure of a young girl with a cowrie shell, which shows that the troops, the Australian troops actually came via Singapore to Naoetsu. There are some gifts of Canberra blue gums, which are particular species of eucalypts, which were gifted by Australia to Naoetsu, which have been planted but have become stunted because of the acute winter cold in that site. And then finally, there are witness trees, hibaku trees from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which take us to the civilian trauma of Japan. So this collection of different features of the Remembrance stories bring together a kind of geography which commemorates Australia in Japan, much in the same way that the Japanese garden commemorated Japan in Australia. Now, this last aspect that I told you of the Hiroshima trees are important because it's always the point of tension between recognizing the problems of military imperialism and the treatment of prisoners of war and Japan's own trauma of, over 100,000 civilian casualties with atomic bombing. And I wanted to end with this final image of the Hiroshima Peace Park, because that is really the park that is the largest kind of global symbol of peace and reconciliation after the war. And it's a space in which the idea of human trauma is most acutely expressed. And to begin to ask the question of then what role do gardens play in this particular kind of narrative of extreme violence and extreme trauma? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anoma and Lynne, for really fascinating analyses of these gardens across space and time. I want to open us up for questions and let folks know that at the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you go not to the chat, but rather to the Q&A section, I invite both students and the public to ask questions. And before we move to that, I'm going to remind students that you should go to B courses right now or before the end of class, because instead of turning in your attendance cards on index cards, you will be filling out the B courses assignment that is in place of that. So I just want to make sure that students know that that's what you're supposed to do and turn in no later than 1:05 today. So while folks are thinking about the questions that they want to pose in the Q&A section, I just want to start by asking Anoma and Lynne a little bit about, what conclusions we can draw about these gardens. We see the gardens at Manzanar that were built by the incarcerated people for their own, to improve their quality of life to the extent that they could. And then many decades later, these gardens are part of a commemorative landscape that is part of the storytelling about that history. And Lynne raised the question of, is the loveliness of the garden somehow erasing the trauma that took place there? And then when we look at the Calorie Garden, which was a modern commemorative garden, which is kind of strange in a way, really, commemorating the escape of these soldiers, these prisoners of war, many of whom did not successfully escape and were killed. And then in more recent years, this garden, perhaps as part of economic development, as you mentioned, as well as a friendship, it's a commemoration of a moment of conflict. And then in Naoetsu, we have a different kind of commemorative landscape that is, I think some people, perhaps some Australians would say, is that also papering over the suffering of those prisoners of war who were treated so badly, the Australians who were kept in very harsh conditions that were not consistent with the Geneva Convention in Japan. And we often speak of gardens as healing spaces, but when is healing appropriate or not? And I would just raise especially for the students who have visited the Angel Island Immigration Station, there is a commemorative landscape that has been constructed there that is not very green. It's not intended to be lovely. It's a hardscape mostly with some words. And the choice there has been to kind of explicitly describe the suffering rather than to create something lovely and contemplative. And I'm just wondering if you all have any thoughts about, how we should begin to think about the design and the role of these kinds of landscapes.
I could speak to the international case studies, and then maybe Lynne, you could talk a little bit about the kind of community efforts, because I can see a question in the Q&A also about the way culture was treated in these spaces that you could also speak about maybe. In the case of these two examples that I looked at, we need to understand that the government was not involved in creating the remembrance spaces. These were community endeavors. In other words, the community themselves felt remorse and wanted to reconcile themselves to that history of their treatment of the prisoners of war. And that was what unified them and made them reach out to each other. So when you think that there is a small town, Calorie, north of the capital, that is creating a transnational relationship of garden making in Australia, and then connecting to this peace park in Naoetsu. And Naoetsu is this, again, a small industrial town that is doing something completely independent of Tokyo. This is where really the importance lies, is that the community begins to mobilize itself and saying, our governments aren't doing something. We need to act, and we need to do something to address this problem that is historical. Now, I think Lynne would be able to speak better about the Manzanar case.
Well, I think it's really interesting that this you started this idea of this community effort, because much of what's happened in Manzanar and later for the commemoration of the site was community driven. So there's always that tension. I mean, there were those tensions within the camps, and then once they were disbanded, that tension never went away. And I think for the just to sort of address the chat question, that in America, it was the scale of this spatial violence that I think was really quite enormous. And it was on a military wartime level where those people, regardless of the fact that there were no charges ever substantiated, they were treated as the enemy. So that was basically the context for their creation of the camps. But it really followed standard military operations, which makes you think about standard military operations. How do they dehumanize people, even soldiers and barracks, and their use of their bodies in wartime? But so I think, but it also comes back to the dilemma of our studies in the United States, that they're so nationally bound. That we really, I mean, I still struggle with this, like, really unpacking this whole situation and linking it to Anoma's work. I mean, it obviously does, but, this link, I think, in American studies, in ethnic studies, it's not taking hold, and I'd like to see it move more in that direction.
Yeah. And I think I'll read the question in the chat so that everybody hears it. And the audience member asks, I understand that incarceration places today have a tendency to strip away the individual's identity and dehumanize them. What is your opinion about how architecture in these detention centers historically aimed for separating people from their culture and identity? What is it about the shape of the buildings or the layout of these detention centers? Was it intentionally trying to be non-cultural, trying to dehumanize people?
I think that the examples that we showed of the North American cases, the difference between the barracks, which were partitioned, 8 families in a barrack, versus having a shack which was shared by 2 families, which had a hearth and which allowed them to cook their meals as a family unit. I mean, this is such a different way of setting up, even though the US camps had more resources and facilities. In fact, their messing practices caused familial dysfunction. It broke up the families. Whereas in the Canadian camps, where they really were impoverished because they were not supported in that way, they basically could all cook and eat together as a family unit. And this had real implications, I think, after the war for family cohesion.
And there was a difference, actually. I didn't make it quite as distinctly as I should have, but there were the executive order camps, which were quite different from the approximately 75 camps that were like internment camps under the Department of Justice, the Immigration Naturalization, INS, through INS. They ran these camps that actually, in some cases, like Crystal City, had individual units for families. So that was a Department of Justice camp. So there were different approaches even within the United States, depending on your citizenship, depending on your location. Because a lot of this was applied only into wartime. The evacuation quote was only for people in war zones and these military zones, right, that were set up by the military. So like more than 3/4 of the nation was outside of those. So there's all of this serendipity too that's involved with these intersections of people and happenstance and how they end up in these camps in different ways. But there's this spatial violence. I think we really, in architecture and planning, we can address that.
And not just that, the idea of being dislocated, of being dispossessed of your material, comforts, of, not being able to have your occupation. All these things, just the spatial distancing and isolation is in itself a physical thing that creates this kind of, really erodes your ability to survive in so many ways. There was something about the gardens that also reflects that, which I think is important. And like, for instance, Calorie, when they set up the garden, there was a period of drought, which was really, the drought was quite severe. And the community members would take turns to come and water the plants. So they would carry the water up to the garden. They would, begin to water the plants. And they had to tend this, it's very dry, semi-arid, similar to the site in Manzanar. And the care that they had to take in itself was part of building that empathy. When the first cherry trees were gifted by Japan to Calorie, they actually became diseased and died and had to be replaced for a while by another kind of species of tree, till cherry trees that were planted in Australia could begin to, adjust to the scenarios. And this happens often with the gifting of cherry trees, that there are periods, I think in Washington also, where the trees wouldn't survive. So the survival of these species that are not endemic, that in itself is almost a kind of parallel story to the traumas that people go through during war. And so there are ways in which the maintenance of a garden through different seasons, through the winter, revival in the spring, the work that goes into setting up a garden, creates the kind of the necessary empathetic investment of the community in that history. And I think that's really important. It's that labor, that physical labor, is actually creating a kind of both, an empathetic labor towards accommodating somebody else's stories, as well as, your own understanding of it. This is important especially in the case of Calorie and in Nauit. So like I said, in Nauit, so the Canberra blue gums got stunted because of the climate and nearly died. So, and then there was another eucalypt in Joetsu City, which was gifted at the same time, which is the bigger kind of city. It was near the town hall. It grew so big that they had to cut it down. So there is a way in which the trees themselves have their own sort of stories. There was one other point that I wanted to make, and which I didn't get around to, but this is something that also set me on looking at these ideas. And it was a comment that was made in a discussion with the post-colonial intellectual Ashish Nandi. And he identified 3 means by which countries can deal with trauma. The first was through compassion, which is reconciliatory peace building. The second was through legal redress, which is what Lynne was talking about. The legal means that, particularly in North America, addressed this problem, but did not happen in places like Australia. And finally, the aesthetic means. And I think that the work of architecture and gardens and remembrance falls within that aesthetic domain. And I'm interested really in how people use these aesthetic and visual means in order to address those issues. Lynne, I wonder whether you can speak to that idea.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking about how we're also looking at, I think people don't realize how hard this research work is actually, and just sort of excavating a lot of stories. And so I don't want to, my share screen shut off my notes. So I want to recognize FM Uematsu, who was the nursery owner who donated 1,000 cherry trees to Manzanar. So this is the kind of moment that we want to bring and make more apparent to people about how this works.
Yeah, I think
was also, yeah, go ahead, Susan.
We need to be wrapping up now. And I think that your observations about empathetic labor are really useful for us moving forward, and for us, especially for students as we move forward in the semester, to think about what is the relationship between the design of landscapes and places, the aesthetic element you mentioned. How does that relate to or support efforts toward redress and legal means? Is there a connection there? You know, does the aesthetic do more than just give people a chance to engage with their compassion, which was the third area that you mentioned? So there's a connection between art and design and the experience of compassion, and how people may be moved through activism to seek legal redress. And in terms of seeking that redress and those reparations, what is the role of art? Does that help build the public support that's needed? And beyond that kind of instrumental role of art and design, is there some kind of movement among the hearts of people when they have a chance to experience places like these gardens? Does that actually lead to changes in laws and redress? So I think that those are some really great questions for us to hold as we move forward. And I just want to thank both of you so much for your investigations, your scholarship, and the way that you've tied together these geographies that are far-flung, but are tied together through military history, through culture, and through the flow of aesthetic traditions that we see kind of bouncing back and forth and being adapted to unfamiliar environments. So I just want to thank you for a wonderful talk, and look forward to continuing these conversations. So thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.